Chapter 16. It's easy to believe something is normal when you're told to expect it. But what if the body lies too? What if the first true warning isn't pain, but silence? The heat came earlier than it should have. It doesn't feel like nature. It seems to be a trap I stepped into without knowing. And whatever triggered it is already too deep to undo. After everything that passed between us, I should have felt steadier. The words I gave him weren't light. They came from the center of me, stripped raw and trembling, but real. And even though he didn't say them back, the way his hand trembled against my cheek, the way the bond surged when his lips met mine, those things should have meant something. But as night deepened and the fire faded to a dull red hush, the room pressed in too close. Lucian's breathing settled into that low, even rhythm that always told me he was trying to surrender to rest, but I couldn't follow him there. My limbs refused stillness. My skin grew too aware of the air around it, of the thin sheet brushing my legs like it was trying to wake something beneath the surface. The ache wasn't sharp. It was subtle, slow warmth, gathering at the base of my spine, pulsing upward in a rhythm I didn't recognize. I told myself it was aftermath. Nerves, the body's release after too much restraint. But when I shifted beneath the covers, and my own scent hit me not entirely my own, altered just slightly, like someone had added a note to a song I'd known all my life, I knew something was wrong. Not dangerous, not yet, but not mine. I slipped out of bed as carefully as I could, keeping my movements quiet. Lucian didn't stir. His silhouette remained still. One arm curled protectively over his ribs, the curve of his body turned just slightly away, as if bracing against a world he didn't want to meet again yet. I didn't blame him. I didn't want to face this version of the world either, the one that now held something foreign under my skin. The hallway beyond was dim, the sconces unlit, moonlight filtering across the stone in ribbons of pale blue. I walked to the bathroom with my arms tight against myself, as if I could press the heat back down through bone and will alone. I didn't turn on the light. The moon was enough. In the mirror, my reflection stopped me cold. I didn't look wrong, not entirely, but there was too much color in my face, a restless brightness in my eyes, and a tension around my mouth like I was holding my breath. My pupils had expanded, swallowing nearly all the silver from my irises, and my skin carried a soft sheen, not sweat exactly, but something like it. I leaned in and pressed my palm to the counter. The stone was cool, but it didn't help. The heat stayed where it was low and pulsing, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that reminded me it had no intention of leaving. It wasn't pain. It wasn't pleasure. It was presence, intent, something buried deeper than flesh. I reached inward for my wolf, for that familiar breath just beneath my own, but found only silence. Not sleep, not exhaustion. Absence. She hadn't disappeared, but she'd gone too far to touch. That had never happened before. I called again, more forcefully, trying to draw her out the way I might in danger, but there was no rise of her beneath my skin, no answering growl or flicker of her eyes behind mine. Nothing. She was watching. I could feel that much, but she wasn't with me. Not fully. As though she sensed something I hadn't caught yet. Something too near. Something not safe. And in that silence, a scent reached me so faint I almost thought I imagined it. Bitter, metal-tinged, a whisper of citrus underneath. I drew it in cautiously, heart stuttering once. It wasn't Lucian. It wasn't mine. And it hadn't come from this room. The wrongness of it sat heavy in my lungs. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water over my face, gripping the sink to anchor myself. The water felt sharp, clean, but it didn't cut through the sensation curling through me. That heat, the strange, waiting pulse had begun to climb now, inching toward my ribs. I pressed a hand to my sternum and stood still, breath held. I told myself again it was nothing. That stress could do strange things, that my body was adjusting to the emotional weight of what I had shared. But deep down, a different understanding had begun to settle. This wasn't mine. This hadn't come from me. It had been introduced, and I didn't know how far it had already reached. When I returned to the bedroom, the silence felt heavier than before, as though the space itself had changed while I was gone. Lucian hadn't moved, and for a moment I just stood there, watching the slow rise and fall of his breath, the faint crease between his brows that never seemed to fully disappear even in sleep. The bond between us still pulsed faintly, quiet but present, yet I didn't reach for it. I didn't lie down beside him. Instead, I sat near the fire, curling into the wide armchair where the shadows were deepest, and pulled the soft wool blanket around my shoulders more to anchor myself than for warmth. The heat in my body hadn't faded. It had grown steadier. Not a flare, not a spike, but a steady, creeping warmth that pulsed just under the surface, like something testing my edges, learning my boundaries. It didn't feel like instinct. It felt like invasion. I tried again to draw my wolf forward, closing my eyes and sinking into the space I usually found her, that familiar, grounding hum beneath the rhythm of my breath. But there was only distance. She was still there, but she wouldn't come close, like something had convinced her to wait, to hold back until the danger passed. But what do you do when the danger is already inside you? I stayed in that chair until the embers in the fireplace went dull and the gray-blue light of early morning touched the window pane. I got dressed before the staff knocked, choosing fabric that didn't cling, pulling my collar higher than usual, avoiding perfume. My skin felt too aware of itself, as though even soft linen could irritate it. Every breath I took felt like I was drawing in more than air, like the world had shifted a few degrees, just enough to feel foreign. I moved through the hallways on autopilot, nodding to those I passed, ignoring the flickers of scent that caught me off guard, sharp hints of steel or alcohol or unfamiliar oils clinging to skin or clothing, as if someone had spilled something they didn't mean to be noticed. No one else seemed to notice anything at all. Ellery intercepted me outside the council chamber, her expression as composed as ever, but her eyes narrowed slightly when they passed over my face. I knew she saw something she always did, but she said nothing. Instead, she offered me the morning report, her fingers brushing mine just long enough that I wondered if she felt the fever under my skin, if she was trying to gauge something I didn't dare speak aloud. I thanked her with a quiet nod and entered the chamber, as if everything inside me hadn't shifted in the night. The session was long and predictable. Complaints from border scouts, a supply ledger dispute, a request from one of the minor packs about rotation schedules. I spoke where I had to, made decisions without hesitating, but every second felt like I was moving from behind glass. Sounds were too sharp, voices too bright, and the heat that had curled inside me now pulsed with every beat of my heart, a slow climb that hadn't yet peaked but would. I felt it waiting. I felt it tracking me. By mid-afternoon, I left the chamber, claiming fatigue. No one questioned it. I walked the stone path behind the west wing until the scent of pine and distant rain dulled the rest of the world. I stood there for a long time, eyes closed, breathing in the cool air, hoping the wind would soothe the heat. It didn't. I pressed a hand to my lower abdomen and closed my eyes, as though I could press the feeling back down, but it had already settled too deep. This wasn't natural. It hadn't followed the rhythm I'd known my entire life. And now, something inside me had changed course entirely. At dusk, I returned to my quarters, dismissed everyone, and lit the fire with shaking fingers. I sat in silence, watching flame and shadow blur, and waited. And when the next wave came, not violent, not overwhelming, but calm and exact, I didn't fight it. I let it move through me because I needed to feel its pattern, understand its texture, not to surrender, to identify it. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't an accident. This wasn't biology. This was orchestration. Someone had opened a door in my body without my permission, and whatever they were trying to awaken, they'd already started. Chapter 17, The Morning Light, didn't bring clarity. It brought ache low, persistent, and deep in a way that didn't match anything I'd known before. I dressed carefully, hiding the way my hands hesitated at buttons, the way every piece of fabric felt like a boundary pressed too tightly against skin that no longer trusted itself. The heat hadn't receded overnight. It had only settled further in, like a guest that now assumed it had the right to stay. I moved through the halls with practiced calm, met every glance with the usual strength I wore like armor, but underneath it all was a rhythm I couldn't stop noticing. My breath no longer obeyed me entirely. It came too quick when I wasn't speaking, too shallow when I needed focus. My skin prickled without provocation. My hearing picked up the metallic clatter of dishes too far down the corridor, the sound of boots grinding over stone with painful clarity. Ellery met me at the edge of the council wing with 2 documents and a sharp glance. Her fingers brushed mine as she passed me the folders, and though her face remained neutral, her eyes stayed on me a moment too long. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I held the silence like a blade between us and kept walking, because if I stopped now, something in me might split open. The heat was manageable for now, contained behind breath and will, but it was growing clever. It didn't shout. It waited. It adjusted. It changed. I knew what true heat felt like, the kind that rose with the bond, with instinct and longing, the kind that a wolf could anticipate and prepare for. But this wasn't that. This had no tether, no shape I recognized. It had no craving for Lucian, specifically just craving. It existed for its own sake, pressing against my nerves like an idea planted too close to the bone. My wolf still hadn't returned. I'd tried to call her again in the early hours, sinking deep into meditation, breath slow and full, waiting for that familiar sensation, her pulse beneath mine, her growl low in my chest, but there was nothing. The silence was more oppressive now. Not a refusal, not resistance, just distance. It felt like she was watching me from behind glass, waiting to see what I would become before she risked coming near. My fingers shook when I lifted the pen to sign the first dispatch. I stilled them with effort and pressed harder, as if force alone could anchor me. Lucian wasn't at the meeting. They said he was handling external territory correspondence, some diplomatic excuse that kept him from sitting too close. Part of me was grateful. Part of me hated that I was grateful. Because if he saw me now, truly saw me, I wasn't sure he'd recognize what was slipping through the cracks. Worse, I wasn't sure I'd want him to. I moved through the morning like a ghost in a familiar shape. I answered questions. I issued commands. I laughed once, tightly, when a junior officer made some clumsy joke about supply routes. No one noticed anything wrong, but I felt my body running ahead of me, like it was listening to a different master, and I was just trying to keep up. At midday, I stepped into the war room alone, needing quiet, needing cold space. The windows were open just enough to let wind bite through the stone, and I stood in front of one, closing my eyes as the breeze hit my neck. It helped barely. The flush in my chest didn't ease, and the air didn't reach deep enough to pull out the heat that had rooted somewhere just above my hips. I gripped the edge of the windowsill, hard enough for my knuckles to ache, and still couldn't feel anything but the slow, pulsing pressure building from within. It wasn't that it hurt. Not yet. It was that it waited, and I didn't know what it was waiting for. I stayed by that window longer than I should have, hoping the cold would do more than numb the skin along my collarbone, hoping it would slow the rhythm building inside me that no longer followed the commands I gave it. But it didn't. The pressure remained, heavy and deliberate, and the heat beneath my ribs began to twist in sharper patterns, now no longer gentle waves, but threads pulling taut beneath the surface, teasing the line between discomfort and something more dangerous. I moved eventually, because stillness was starting to make me feel like I might splinter from the inside. The rest of the day passed in a blur of color and sound, each interaction leaving me more frayed, each scent around me too thick, too layered. The world had become a cacophony I was expected to navigate with grace. By the time I returned to my quarters, my head ached from trying to hold composure in a body that no longer fit. I locked the door behind me and stood with my back against it, breathing slowly, counting down from 50, trying to find some calm, but the calm never came. The space was dim, the fire low, and the air carried a faint echo of the night before. I moved slowly toward the corner table, where last night's untouched glass of wine still waited, rim stained with a trace of red, the surface dulled to a shadowy sheen. I hadn't thought about it until now, not since I'd set it down after our conversation, too overwhelmed to drink, too torn between what I'd said and what he hadn't. But now, standing before it, something in me tightened. I leaned down slowly, sniffed once, twice, and pulled back with a sharp inhale. It was subtle, almost masked, but unmistakable once I found it. The same bitter metal scent I'd caught in the bathroom mirror hours earlier. Not strong, not enough to overwhelm, but present, buried under the fruit and smoke of the wine, layered just faintly at the rim where the scent clung like memory. My stomach clenched, not from fear, but recognition. Someone had touched this. Someone had tampered. I stared at the glass for a long moment, chest tightening. The scent was old now, almost evaporated, but it was there. Oil, metal, a trace of something chemical, not enough to knock me unconscious. Not enough to stop my mind, but maybe just enough to start something inside my body that didn't belong. I backed away, wiping my palms against my thighs, suddenly aware of the flush climbing again, the heat deepening behind my eyes. My pulse jumped in my throat, and I pressed a hand there, grounding myself. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't natural. Something had been placed in that glass, just enough to open a door, and my body had walked through it. I turned toward the window again, needing distance from the scent, and caught sight of myself in the glass. Hair disheveled, mouth parted slightly, cheeks still too pink. I didn't recognize the expression on my own face. Hunger, not for food, not for power, not even for touch. It was deeper. It lived behind my ribs now, waiting for something to answer it. I stood still until the shaking in my legs stopped. Then I gathered the glass with trembling fingers, wrapping it in linen before hiding it deep in the drawer of my desk, locking it shut. No one could see it. Not yet. Not until I knew what it meant, until I knew who had given it to me. I needed time. Time to think. Time to fight what was happening to me from the inside. Time to understand how far this went. Because if the heat wasn't mine, then neither was the desire. And if I couldn't trust the way my body reacted, then I had to rely on the one thing I still controlled: silence. Chapter 18, the best lies are the ones you tell yourself. The ones you rehearse in silence until they sound like instinct, until they shape your posture and your breath, and the tilt of your mouth when you say I'm fine. I had spent the last 24 hours perfecting mine, and no one had called me on it. That alone frightened me more than the heat ever could. If they couldn't see it, maybe I was better at hiding than I realized, or maybe they had already stopped looking. My steps through the stone halls were measured, deliberate, matching the rhythm I'd drilled into myself through years of needing to appear unshaken. But the woman walking now was not the same one who had claimed leadership with blood under her nails and strategy in her voice. My body was becoming untrustworthy. It reacted before I gave it permission. The air stung the inside of my nose as if every scent had been sharpened to a blade. Fabric clung to my skin in all the wrong places, making me shift too often. My own sweat felt scented with something faintly chemical, almost artificial, and it clung to my throat with every breath. I was overheating from the inside out, and yet no fire touched my skin. The temperature in the keep hadn't changed, only the world beneath my bones had. My wolf stirred again early that morning, but not the way she used to. There was no protective edge, no low hum of shared focus, only an odd, flickering presence that came and went like she was trying to approach a memory she no longer trusted. For a heartbeat, I thought she might break through. Then she disappeared again, leaving me hollow in places I had always considered solid. It made everything feel more distant. Every gesture I made, every word I spoke, even my own voice sounded unfamiliar when I addressed the logistics team, my tone flat where it should have carried command. Lucian was in the outer courtyard that morning, overseeing a weapons shipment. I sensed him more than I saw him. His presence pulled at the edges of the bond, not in hunger, not even in confusion, but with a weight I couldn't name. I refused to turn toward him. My body had learned by now that his scent was both danger and temptation. If the heat reached for him, I didn't want to know it. I didn't want to feel it. My discipline was starting to erode at the edges. Not enough to break, not enough to draw attention. But I knew where the first cracks were. I forgot a name in council that I'd repeated twice just the day before. I paused for half a beat too long when asked about the patrol shifts in the West Woods. Ellery raised her eyes slightly. That was all, but I felt her watching me more closely after that. The worst came during the early afternoon drills. I'd insisted on maintaining my schedule, told the guards and my advisors that I needed to remain visible, consistent. But the second my blade met the steel of another's, I knew something had shifted in me. My grip felt off. The weight of the weapon didn't settle into my palm the way it always had. I adjusted, forced myself to move with grace, but there was a hollowness behind every strike as if my body knew the form but no longer carried the reason. I took a shallow blow to the side and barely registered the sting. That terrified me. Not the pain, but the absence of it. I was being dulled in the wrong ways, sharpened in others. Like my senses had been rerouted, repurposed. When I excused myself after a second round, no one stopped me. I passed Lucian in the corridor not long after, his eyes following me like he was waiting for something, like the bond between us was telling him more than I wanted it to. I walked on without a word. I didn't stop until I reached the far end of the east tower, where the corridor narrowed and the windows faced the cliffs beyond the keep. I leaned against the stone frame, letting the wind roll across my skin, sharp and cold enough to make my eyes sting. It helped barely. The air was clean, untouched, and it cut through the haze I'd been carrying all day, but it didn't reach far enough to burn away what had settled beneath my ribs. My body felt borrowed now, like I had slipped into a version of myself that responded to rules I hadn't written. Every movement was just a beat off, a half breath late or early, my center of balance constantly readjusting like I was walking over shifting ice. The warmth didn't come in waves anymore. It lived under my skin now, slow and coiled, winding deeper with every hour, not rising with desire but curling with intention. I stood there a long time, hands braced against the wall, until my wrists ached and my shoulders trembled not from fatigue, but from resisting the urge to let go and see what would happen if I stopped fighting it. My wolf hovered in the distance, the way prey watches from the edge of a clearing, present but unwilling to cross. She didn't trust the thing inside me, and I was beginning to understand why. This wasn't simply early heat. This was something else, something seated. I returned to my quarters after dusk, requesting no fire, no food, no company. I wanted stillness, but the silence only made the dissonance louder. I peeled off my clothes and changed slowly, every touch of linen against skin drawing a reaction I didn't recognize, shivers, flinches, breath that hitched as if the fabric had memory. I caught my reflection in the mirror as I turned and nearly didn't stop. The woman staring back at me looked like me, but her pupils were blown wide, rimmed with silver. Her lips were parted, flushed as though from kissing, and a faint sheen glowed at her collarbones where the candlelight touched. I hadn't lit the candle. I didn't remember moving toward it. The heat pulsed again, not with urgency but precision, like it was tracking time in my blood, counting heartbeats, calibrating. I pressed a hand to my chest and felt nothing but rhythm. No chaos, no confusion, just an answer I didn't remember asking for. And through all of it, the bond remained quiet. Lucian's presence hovered on the edge of my senses, far, but not gone. He hadn't come near me all day. Maybe he felt it too. Maybe he was waiting for me to break. Part of me wanted to go to him, to press my hand to his chest, and ask if he could feel the foreign thing trying to crawl its way into my name. But I didn't move. I was afraid of what the bond would do, what it might awaken in him, or in me, if touched. I curled into the window seat, bones drawn tight, pressing my forehead against the cold glass and staring at the line where mountains met sky. The horizon had gone violet blue, dusted with the last streaks of sun. It should have made me feel grounded. Instead, it made me feel like I was watching the world from someone else's memory. My thoughts ran slow, my pulse quick. The heat kept climbing. Not painful, not seductive, just present, like breath inside a locked room. I stayed there until the stars came out and the cold seeped into my spine. And when I finally rose, legs stiff and throat dry, I realized I wasn't afraid of the heat anymore. I was afraid of how well I had learned to live with it, of how easily I had adjusted to something I should have fought. Whatever this was, it wasn't done yet, and whatever it wanted, it had already taken root. Chapter 19. I told myself it would pass, that if I stayed very still, if I didn't move or think too loudly, the thing inside me would grow bored and quiet again, that it wasn't real, that it was only the echo of something chemical, artificial, an infection I could outlast. But the heat didn't fade. It changed shape. It had learned to breathe when I breathed, to pulse when I blinked, to stretch when I did, like a shadow that mirrored me but held its own desires. By nightfall, it had settled behind my ribs, thick and low, humming in the spaces between my thoughts, waiting. I lay rigid on the bed, fully clothed, back straight, arms crossed over my chest like I could hold myself together by force alone. The air felt too warm, even though no fire had been lit. I had closed the windows, drawn the curtains, blocked out every draft, and still, the heat rose, slow and patient, wrapping itself around my spine like a second skeleton. My limbs tingled, not with pleasure, not quite, but with something like pressure, like gravity had shifted and now pulled inward. I turned my face to the pillow once, thinking scent might calm it, familiar cloth, linen, the faintest trace of my own oils, but it only sharpened the ache. My body wanted, but it didn't know what. Or worse, it did, and I refused to follow. I felt Lucian long before I sensed him through the bond, not in touch or sight, but in the way the air changed when his name stirred in my chest. He wasn't near. He hadn't sought me out, but his presence pressed at me all the same, subtle, indirect, like a question he hadn't dared to ask. The heat reacted, not with clarity, not with direction, but with anticipation, a quiet pulse low in my hips that grew stronger each time I forced myself not to move. I sat up too quickly, my breath catching, my palms damp. I had to leave the room, had to move. The walls were too close, and my skin too loud with sensation. The corridor was cool, stone beneath my feet smooth and grounding, but it didn't help. I walked with silent steps, knowing the way to his room even with my eyes half closed. I didn't plan it. I didn't mean it. My body moved before reason caught up. Each breath pulled the memory of his scent deeper, leather, pine, the faint trace of steel, and something darker that only existed when he was near and angry. That scent had once made me feel safe. Now it drew the heat like a current, like a tide rising towards something it could claim. I paused at the end of the west hall, fingers brushing the edge of the archway. His door was 5 strides away. The air between us tasted like metal. My heart was pounding too fast to pretend I had come here by mistake. I wasn't thinking of conversation or comfort or answers. I wanted relief, contact, something solid to anchor this ache that had stopped being theoretical. And then my wolf moved. Not forward, not to stop me, but to look. It was the strangest sensation, as if she stood behind my eyes and turned her head to study me, not with fear, not with instinct, but with caution. I waited for her to lunge up and take control. She didn't. She observed. And in that moment, I understood that if I knocked, if I opened that door, it wouldn't be me stepping through it. It would be the heat, whatever it had become, whatever had been planted. And Lucian would answer with instinct, because that's what bonds do when the scent is strong enough when the Omega knocks. I took a single step back, then another, and then I turned and walked away, not quickly, not in panic, but with the kind of resolve that costs something. My hands were shaking by the time I reached my quarters. My mouth was dry. My body ached with tension that had nowhere to go. I locked the door and pressed my forehead to the wood, breathing hard, telling myself that what I'd done was enough. That resisting it once was victory, but the thing inside me didn't rage. It didn't scream. It just watched, and that frightened me more than anything else. I didn't sleep. I lay curled beneath the thin coverlet with my eyes wide open, heart beating like it was caught between sprints, each breath a quiet war between control and collapse. My body still pulsed, but quieter now, like the heat had learned a lesson from my refusal and chosen a subtler path. It didn't push. It coiled, waiting, adapting. I felt it recenter lower, deeper, curling around nerves and thought like smoke finding cracks in stone. I kept my hands still, fingers pressed together beneath my ribs to remind myself I still belonged to myself. When dawn began its slow climb over the mountains, painting the edges of the keep in pale gold, I finally rose, moving like someone who'd walked too far without rest. The floor was cold. I welcomed it. I welcomed the brush of cool air at my neck, the dryness of my mouth, the faint sting in my thighs when I stretched. I welcomed anything that reminded me that pain, however minor, still answered me. My wolf did not. She had gone deeper. If I had imagined the flicker of her the night before, it was gone now. In her place was silence, not empty, just watchful. I dressed slowly, choosing fabric that clung less, and tied my hair back with careful fingers. My reflection showed a face that looked composed, but under the skin, I could feel the disruption. Something inside me had changed, something essential. I no longer flinched when the heat stirred. I no longer reacted like a body in protest. And that scared me most. Adaptation is a form of surrender, and I was beginning to mold around the thing inside me instead of fighting it. When I stepped out into the corridor, the halls were already busy, advisors moving between meetings, guards changing posts, Ellery issuing clipped instructions to someone 2 steps behind her. I kept my pace steady, made eye contact, returned greetings. But as I moved past Lucian's quarters, the bond between us sparked without warning. A sharp pull at the center of my chest, like a thread catching against bone. I didn't stop, but I slowed, just for a breath. His scent didn't reach me. His voice didn't call. But I felt the question echo through the bond like a knock with no hand behind it. He knew, or rather he felt. The heat inside me responded immediately, stretching toward the sensation like a predator toward motion. I held my breath and kept walking. He hadn't opened the door. He hadn't followed. He had felt the pull and chosen silence. I didn't know if that was mercy or fear. Part of me was grateful. The other part wanted to turn around and demand why he hadn't stopped me the night before, why he hadn't come looking. But I knew the answer. He didn't want to see me like this. And if he did, he might not be able to resist the bond. I was no longer sure it was safe for either of us to test it. I reached the strategy hall and stood for 2 hours as updates were delivered, reports read aloud, questions raised about the border activity and supply rotation. I answered when required, nodded at the right moments, signed 2 orders. I didn't hear half of it. My focus fractured and reformed again and again, like my mind was trying to remain anchored to a shore being pulled out to sea. Ellery said nothing, but I caught her eyes more than once, too sharp, too alert. She knew, or at least she was starting to suspect. I could see it in the way her posture shifted near me, like she was preparing for something she couldn't name. I left before the session ended. My head ached. My spine felt too warm. I needed air. Not wind, not weather air. Breath, distance from this building, these eyes, the pull of walls that made the heat grow bolder when no one looked. I walked to the southern watchpoint, where the overlook curved above the river valley, and nothing man-made could interrupt the sky. There, finally, I could breathe without pretending. I stood at the edge and closed my eyes. The heat remained, curled like a question against my back, but it didn't surge. It pulsed, almost gently, almost satisfied. And for the first time since this began, I admitted it. This was not just a symptom. It was a strategy. And if I didn't find its purpose before someone else did, I would become its weapon. Chapter 20. I didn't remember him at first. He was just another presence in the room that night, silent and unremarkable. Part of the blur of hands that poured wine, cleared plates, bowed and vanished without needing to be seen. But something about the way he'd placed the glass too precise, too measured had lodged in the back of my mind, a detail that felt off but never rose to the surface until now. I was reviewing West Border shifts with Ellery, her voice low and clipped when the image came back unbidden. The slope of a shoulder, the sharpness of a jaw half turned from me, fingers curled too elegantly around crystal for a man in service. I blinked, startled by how vivid the fragment had become. Not full, not clear, but potent. My breath caught before I could stop it. I tried to dismiss the thought as paranoia, heat-fueled suspicion born from sleepless nights, and a body I no longer trusted. But the sensation it left in my chest, tight, cold, ancient, didn't fade. It deepened. I excused myself with a tight nod, not waiting for Ellery's response, and walked briskly through the east wing, the corridors narrowing as I approached the inner archives. My heartbeat had picked up again, not like desire, not like panic, but like something old and instinctive, the way animals move when the wind carries the scent of something that shouldn't be there. The archive was silent, the records thick with dust and order. I found the rota logs, quickly duty schedules, entry codes, daily assignments, and flipped backward through the last 2 weeks. The name came into view like it had been waiting. Thomas, assigned to the central wing dining route for 6 evenings, all overlapping the time of Lucian's injury and my shift. And then nothing. No notes of reassignment, no citations, no transfer. Just a blank. Not even a mistake in the ledger. Just absence. That was worse. My fingertips pressed harder into the edge of the page, as if pressure might extract something more. But it didn't. I closed the book slowly and set it aside. The room felt colder, though I knew that was impossible. A slow breath left me, but it didn't ease the weight climbing my spine. The heat inside me stirred, low and sharp, but not with hunger this time, with recognition, as if it, too, understood that we were remembering something together. My wolf shifted, not his breath or voice or growl, but like the roll of muscle under fur in darkness, subtle and certain. She hadn't moved in days. I felt her watching, leaning forward, trying to place the scent we couldn't reach. And then came the flicker, not of Thomas, but of something behind him. A shadow carried in the slope of his posture, the flick of his wrist when he'd set the glass before me. A mimicry of confidence, something that didn't belong to a servant. Not truly. I stood frozen for several seconds, the image beginning to unfurl behind my eyes not as memory, but as comparison. The way his shoulders set. The walk. The stillness that wasn't submission, but held. Measured. Trained. That was when fear started to shift into calculation. This hadn't been improvisation. Whoever placed that drink in my hands had done so with a purpose. A test, perhaps, or a signal, or a slow detonation wrapped in politeness. And now he was gone. Not excused, not dismissed, not relocated. Gone like smoke, gone like someone covering a trail they'd never intended to leave. I exhaled shakily, trying to lock the thought down, to keep it from running too far ahead of the evidence. But even as I tried to ground myself, my fingers twitched at my side, and a slow burn began to rise behind my breastbone. Not from heat, from certainty. This hadn't started with me. It had started with a decision made elsewhere by someone who believed my body was a door, and they'd already found the key. I stepped out of the archive with the weight of absence dragging behind my ribs like an echo too heavy to name. The air in the hallway felt thicker now, even though nothing had changed. Same stone, same light, same guards posted in stillness like shadows that had always belonged there. But something had shifted inside me, around me. The knowledge wasn't yet proof, but it lived like it was. I moved with purpose but not haste, each step calculated, balanced between drawing attention and appearing unchanged. I knew I had to wait. The worst thing I could do now was speak before I understood the shape of what I was holding. I returned to my quarters without looking directly at anyone, not because I feared what they'd see, but because I wasn't ready for them to see me seeing it. I didn't sit when I reached my room. I stood by the hearth, staring at the place where the flame would be if I'd allowed it to be lit. The cold was a better ally now. It reminded me that I still felt, that my skin still responded to the world, and not just to the thing growing inside it. The heat remained low and taut, like a wire pulled tight but not plucked. No immediate threat, no surge, but it was awake, and it was listening. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, reaching inward again not for calm but for her. My wolf. This time, she answered not with words, but with presence stronger than before. She circled just under my ribs, lean and sharp, ears forward, not in fear but in readiness. She had caught the scent too, not in the air, in the memory, the trace of something synthetic overlaid with something very old. And it wasn't just the wine. It was the man, Thomas, or whatever name he wore. There had been something in his movement, something too familiar, and now it curled like smoke through my mind. I tried to summon every detail, the shift of his shoulder as he bent, the control in his step as he exited. No tension, no nerves. It hadn't been an error. It had been method. The more I examined it, the more my own body began to react not with panic, but with a strange precision, as though some part of me had always known and was only now surfacing to help. The ache in my muscles receded. My hands steadied. The heat pulsed in rhythm but didn't rise. Control, faint and fragile, but mine again. I moved to the drawer where I had hidden the wrapped wineglass and pulled it open slowly, watching the linen shift in the low light. The scent had mostly faded now, but when I inhaled close, it still carried something sharp like oil and citrus and steel. The same bitter trace from the bath, from my skin, from the strange pulse that had awakened the first night. I didn't need to test it yet. I would, but not until I had a name to link it to. And whoever had done this had hidden their trail too well to chase directly. That meant they expected distance to protect them. That meant time was mine. I locked the drawer again and moved to the table, laying out the staff logs I had copied, marking each unexplained gap and shift, matching rotation with wing and time. If Thomas had help, it wouldn't be in records. It would be in rhythm how the gaps aligned with patrol shifts, how kitchen and corridor cleared at the wrong moment. It was meticulous, quiet, strategic, and it made one thing very clear. This wasn't about seduction, or weakness, or bond manipulation. This was about infiltration, not just of the keep, but of me. I stared at the last page until the candle beside me burned halfway down. I didn't speak. I didn't move. And when I finally rose and walked to the window, the moon was already high. I touched my fingers to the glass, cool and clean, and watched my reflection flicker. My wolf stood behind my eyes now. Not gone, not afraid, ready. Whoever did this thought I wouldn't notice, thought I would burn quietly, lose clarity, lose power. But I was still here, and I remembered his face.
Chapter 21. The scent was faint at first, barely a trace in the air, clinging to leather and stone like the echo of something that had no business returning. It brushed past me in the war hall 2 mornings ago, a whisper of oil and acid and citrus laid beneath the usual weight of parchment and steel. No one else noticed. No one paused. But I did. My steps faltered just enough to register, not to draw attention. I turned my head slightly, as if reading something in the air, then continued walking, my pulse suddenly louder than my breath. It wasn't unfamiliar, though I couldn't name it immediately. Not until it returned the next day near the south gate, where crates of weapons were being catalogued under a shipment I hadn't approved. I approached under the pretense of inspection, watched a handler break a seal and lift a scabbard, and there it was again, stronger this time, more direct. I inhaled without meaning to, and it hit me like a memory carved into scent. Burnt lemon rind, machine oil, and something bitter that didn't belong on any blade. It didn't come from the metal. It came from hands, from skin, from a process. That's when it clicked. I had smelled it once before, standing in the shadow of the eastern yard beside my father, back when I was too proud to understand what instinct really meant. He'd shown me a broken blade, notched and stained, wrapped in cloth that stank of solvent. "Not every wound you carry will bleed," he'd said, pressing the cloth to my nose, making me recoil. "Some will mark you in the quiet. Smell that, Lucian. Learn it." And I had. I just didn't realize I'd kept it. Until now. I spent the next few hours in silence, moving between patrol updates and scroll reports with half my attention fixed behind my eyes. The scent had found a shape, and that shape was too familiar. When I passed the central wing's service corridor later that afternoon, I paused beneath the arch without meaning to. The wall was clean, the torches burning low, but something in my spine tensed. My gaze caught on a narrow shadow behind a rack of unused gear, too tucked, too careful. I stepped closer. There, folded nearly flat beneath an empty linen wrap, was a cloth creased, unstained white. I lifted it and brought it to my nose. The smell was old but still there. Oil, metal, and that same bitter slick edge, as if lemon had spoiled over rust. I stood still for a long time, breathing it, naming it, matching it, and then the image of a man surfaced. Not loud, not fully formed. Just the impression of movement, shoulders held too square, arms that never fidgeted, silence that looked more like strategy than deference. Thomas. He hadn't spoken to me directly, not once, I remembered his face only because of how forgettable it was. Quiet eyes, neat hands, the kind of presence meant to pass unnoticed, except that it hadn't. Not now, not anymore. I hadn't seen him since the night Kasia had come to my quarters, since everything inside me had begun to fracture. I didn't know what he'd done, but I knew what he'd left behind. The scent of sabotage, and something older, something that doesn't strike with violence but waits. Ruts. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. You don't chase a shadow by screaming at it. You follow its weight in the floorboards. I returned the cloth to the shadows where I'd found it and walked the perimeter of the corridor twice before heading to my study. My hands smelled like warning. My thoughts burned slow. The last time I had followed a hunch like this, it had ended in blood and silence. This time, I intended to be the one watching, even if I didn't yet know where the strike would come from. The mind doesn't forget danger, it buries it deep, beneath logic and duty and the need to keep moving, but it never lets go. And the moment scent or silence or memory stirs that old warning, it rises. I didn't sleep that night. I sat alone in the high alcove chamber, the one no one used unless they had something to hide. The fire had burned low and I hadn't relit it. I needed the dark, the quiet. I sat with scrolls unrolled across the desk, names, rosters, training logs, kitchen rotations, but I didn't read them. I watched the space between them, the pattern of things that weren't written, the way Thomas had disappeared without a single note. That was the part that wouldn't let me go. His name was too soft, too pliable, like something borrowed. I tried to remember the sound of his voice and couldn't, but I remembered the way he stood straight-backed, too still. The kind of stillness that looks like obedience until you realize it's not stillness at all, just coiled patience. He hadn't reacted to tone or presence. Not when Kasia spoke in that clipped command that always made junior officers flinch. Not when I snapped at a guard for misreporting the watch change. Thomas never flinched. He just stood, like he wasn't really there to serve, like he was watching for something else. I walked the halls early, long before the keep woke. The light was thin and gray, and the sound of my own steps felt heavier than usual, as if the stone beneath me was testing each one. I passed 3 guards near the west stair. 2 looked past me. 1 met my gaze too long. Not defiantly, just knowingly. I didn't stop, but I didn't forget. Down in the southeast storage corridor, a kitchen boy pretended to be adjusting spice inventory when I walked past. I didn't speak to him either. People were watching, not just me, each other, and the ones who sensed I was watching back had started to choose sides without realizing it. That was more dangerous than silence. In silence, you're invisible. When they start choosing how to act around you, how to breathe near you, that means you're already inside their calculations. I returned to my quarters before the rest of the inner circle stirred. Kasia wasn't visible anywhere in the halls. That didn't mean she was unaware. I'd seen the way her posture had changed lately. Not fragile, never fragile, but enclosed. Less like a queen, more like a wolf with a broken leg hiding her limp from the pack. Whatever she was battling, it was still private, but I could feel it pressing against the bond now and then, like a hand brushing the edge of a curtain, asking to be seen and retreating before it was pulled aside. And behind that curtain, I could smell something more than discomfort. I could smell design. My father's words followed me everywhere these days, curling through memory when I least wanted them. If you ever think the enemy's gone, count again. The best ones hide in the shape of those who serve you. The first time he said it, I thought he meant betrayal from within the council. Now I realized he had meant something more personal. The kind of betrayal that doesn't speak, that doesn't need an army. Just an unlocked door and the belief that no one's watching. My wolf stirred again, slow and deliberate. His presence wasn't demanding. It was focused. He moved behind my ribs like a blade unsheathed, testing weight before striking. Not hunting yet, but awake. And I understood. There was nothing to act on, not yet. No names to accuse. No blade to draw. Not until I knew what Thomas had touched. Not until I knew who sent him. Because no one disappears from a stronghold like this without cover. And no one poisons a mate bond without confidence that no one will trace it back. I would wait, watch, let them think I was still unsteady, still distracted, still healing. Let them believe Kasia was alone. Let them make their next move, thinking we wouldn't see it. Then I'd bury them with the silence they mistook for surrender.
Chapter 22. There are moments when a room becomes quieter, not because the voices fall, but because the meaning between them sharpens to a blade. The council chamber wasn't silent, not exactly, but I felt the pause before it happened. The breath held too long, the fingers tightening on the edge of parchment, the subtle shift in posture when men prepare to strike, but pretend they're simply considering options. I'd seen it too many times, and this time it was aimed at me. The meeting had begun like any other reports, resource tallies, mention of unrest near the western ridge, but I knew from the way Ellery avoided my eyes that something else had been seeded in the agenda long before we stepped into the stone. They didn't say my name at first. They didn't need to. The phrasing was soft. Stability during uncertain times, reinforcement of legacy, a strong public-facing presence, all empty words meant to draw shape around a single truth they didn't have the spine to state directly, that they were preparing to remove me, not with vote, not with trial, but with pressure. I kept my expression neutral, watching the men shift uncomfortably in their seats as I said nothing. The less I reacted, the more they fidgeted. One of the younger advisors, Nalvar, I think, his voice always too smooth, finally leaned forward and cleared his throat. There is precedent, he began, his tone deliberately calm, for reevaluation in times when leadership is compromised. Compromised? The word settled between us like ash on water. It didn't sink. It spread. I inclined my head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Are you referring to injury? I asked, voice level. To lineage? Or to something else you're afraid to name? He hesitated. Perfect. The elder to his left, Brian, white-bearded and wolf-eyed, cut in before Nalvar could answer. We mean no insult, Luna. Only that the pack needs assurance. You've been distant. Distant. A polite way to say they'd sensed the change. The silence, the heat under my skin that hadn't yet erupted, but had begun to warp the edges of how I moved, how I listened. I straightened my spine. You'll find me no more distant than any alpha in the throes of leadership. My voice didn't tremble, not even once, unless you'd like to set a new precedent and define weakness by silence rather than failure. Another pause. Brian didn't flinch, but he didn't press either. They weren't ready for open challenge. Not yet, which meant they were testing how far they could push before I pushed back. I gave them no satisfaction. I let the air stretch thin again until someone further down the table coughed to break the tension. Ellery finally spoke, her voice like a blade hidden in silk. Is there a name under consideration? She already knew. She wanted them to say it. I could have kissed her for the precision of the question. And there it was. Another voice, older, less eager, less sure. Dorian of the Wormrest line. His name struck the air like a dull bell resonant, expected, impersonal. He had been in the wind for weeks. His presence whispered in corridors, his loyalties uncertain. But now they said it aloud. That made it real. That made it war. I didn't flinch. I leaned forward instead, elbows on the table, hands folded. I've heard of Dorian. He's strong, disciplined, excellent hunter, upbeat, and politically deaf. That stung. They didn't respond. The silence returned, heavier than before. I let it settle, then rose from my chair with slow deliberation. Not too fast, not angry, just firm. You are within your rights to call a challenge, I said calmly, and I am within mine to accept it. Nalvar looked pale. Brian nodded slowly, measuring. I kept my hands steady at my sides, even though the heat beneath my skin had started to coil again, not in panic, not in loss of control, but in readiness. For the first time since this began, I felt it shift with me, not against me, like something inside was beginning to align. The fire hadn't left, but I no longer feared its presence. I would learn to wield it. And if they thought bringing a man like Dorian to my doorstep would break me, they had forgotten one very simple truth. I don't shatter. I choose when to burn. They let me leave without protest, which told me more than their words ever could. If they had wanted to trap me into immediate confrontation, they would have blocked the exit with protocol, called a witness, summoned a mediator. But they didn't. They let me walk away, and in doing so, confirmed that this wasn't about process, it was about pressure. They hoped I'd falter on my own. They hoped the heat would finish the job they were too careful to stain their hands with. I walked the length of the keep without looking back, each step measured, each breath deliberate, the echo of Dorian's name still thick in my ears. I remembered him only faintly strong. Yes, skilled, yes, but also blunt. One of those males whose idea of leadership was rooted in strength of body and depth of voice, not strategy. He had allies. He had reputation, but he did not have me, and he would find that made all the difference. When I reached my private wing, I paused only briefly before entering. The scent of stone and cedar met me like a familiar warning, grounding. I moved to the basin and splashed cold water onto my face, watching the droplets roll from my jawline with something close to detachment. My reflection was calm, sharp, my lips pale. I looked nothing like someone cracking, and yet inside, the fire had not left. It burned in quieter ways now, no longer screaming to be named, but breathing with me, winding through muscle and marrow like a second rhythm. I sat near the window, back straight, and opened the first tactical scroll I could find, not for information, but for rhythm, for structure. I needed my thoughts to fall into form again. The heat pulsed in response, but didn't resist. It watched, waited, almost as if it understood that the test had changed, and that it now needed to align with my will or be discarded entirely. A knock came some time later. 2 beats, then silence. Ellery. I didn't speak. She entered anyway, wordless as always, and stood across from me with the familiarity of someone who had long ago stopped asking for permission. She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable, then set a sealed report down beside the scroll and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "They will call it in 2 days, she said, voice low. "Dorian has accepted." I nodded once, barely. She left without another word, and I let the silence swallow her absence like breath. 2 days. That was time enough. Time to rebuild the rhythm of my body. Time to align the wolf inside me with the fire I now refused to fear. Time to sharpen the blade they thought I had dropped. I spent the rest of the evening in silence, cycling through muscle drills in the far chamber until my legs shook and my vision blurred, not to punish, but to remember. What pain felt like, what exhaustion offered that fire could not. The heat pulsed in tandem, not trying to override me but to test me, and I passed, again and again, until I collapsed to my knees on the stone floor, arms slick with sweat, breath sawing through clenched teeth, and still I had not broken. I let the moment stretch long, palms flat, head bowed, then rose with deliberate grace, letting the ache in my bones remind me of exactly what I carried. Not a weakness, not a flaw, a forge, and it would burn for me now, not through me. At midnight, I washed in silence, braided my hair back into a fighter's knot, and stood at the mirror for a long moment. The reflection that looked back was not softer, not bruised. It was still, absolute, and in the quiet hum beneath my skin, I felt the wolf shift forward, not to fight, but to join me, to stand beside me, not behind. And that, more than anything, told me I was ready. Let them call it a challenge. Let them bring their hunter. I would meet him with bare hands and a steady spine, because I did not rise to prove them wrong. I rose to prove myself right. Chapter 23. They told me Dorian would arrive by noon, but I felt him long before the banner crested the southern ridge. It was the way the air shifted, subtle, but certain, how sound traveled just a beat slower, how the guards at the outer watch stood straighter without realizing they had. It was in the way my wolf raised her head beneath my ribs, not in alarm, but in sharpened awareness. I stood on the upper terrace, the high platform that overlooked the main road, hands behind my back, spine still, and watched the dust rise before the horses were even visible. The banner came first, deep blue with a silver wolf in motion, the lines too perfect to be ancient, freshly commissioned for this arrival. Below it, his procession moved like a promise, quiet, precise, armored but not aggressively so. He made them march without banners clashing or weapons drawn. Controlled, intentional. Dorian always knew how to craft the right silhouette. He was the kind of male who didn't need to draw a blade to make a point. He made the idea of it sharper. When he dismounted, it was in a single, smooth motion, armor polished, boots clean, not a bead of dust on him. He inclined his head, nothing more, and waited. I matched him, just slightly slower. Measured. Let the space between our movements speak instead of words. "Dorian," I said clearly, letting the syllables strike the air clean. "You've come quickly." The summons was overdue, he replied, voice deep, practiced, designed to travel. "I would have come sooner, but I was told you were recovering." That word lingered, polished to sound gentle but heavy beneath. I kept my expression still. "Recovery isn't weakness," I said. "It's preparation." "Then I'm glad to arrive in time for the end of it," he said smoothly, his gaze flicking behind me, to the advisors gathered on the balcony, to Ellery at my right shoulder. His eyes lingered a heartbeat longer than was polite. He was taking measure. Of me, of them, of how far he'd be allowed to reach. I stepped forward once, letting the heel of my boot strike stone, the sound too loud in the expectant hush. "You've come to observe?" I asked. "Or to participate?" "That depends on what I see," he answered. "But I'm not here to threaten. I'm here to offer strength. If that strength is found lacking elsewhere," a pause, "calculated, then I'll answer what duty asks of me." The words were crafted to sound noble, but I could feel the counsel behind them, their phrasing, their fingerprints. This wasn't Dorian's ambition. This was someone else's script, worn into his tongue. The heat under my skin stirred, not spiking, but aware, like it had caught the scent of something worth bracing for. I breathed slowly, deeply, steadying it. Not now. I would not let my body interpret presence as provocation. Not when I needed stillness more than fire. The gathered pack began to whisper behind us. Small shifts. A cough, a turn of the head, a rustle of fabric. They wanted tension, expected a scene, but I gave them none. Then observe, train if allowed, speak if asked, but don't mistake invitation for inheritance. His expression flickered for the first time, just a twitch of the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. He was reading me as I was reading him, and neither of us liked what we found. He wasn't here for blood. Not yet. He was here to watch the cracks form, to test how many days I could hold before something slipped. I stepped back, signaling the end of the exchange without dismissing him. Let him stand in the open, among the guards and dignitaries, and feel the weight of every eye that no longer bowed easily. Let him wonder how many were still mine. The heat remained quiet in my chest, coiled but not pressing. Watching, and so did I. Dorian moved through the heart of the keep with the polished ease of someone who had spent years perfecting how to make every step appear uncalculated, when in truth, nothing about him was accidental. From the moment he dismissed his guard to walk among the central courtyards alone, it became clear to me that his presence here wasn't a matter of obligation or pride, it was performance, carefully measured to sway those who still believed strength came from silence and tradition. He offered smiles in passing that didn't reach his eyes, made small comments about changes to the training schedule, and greeted the handlers and warriors by name in a way that implied old familiarity, though I doubted he remembered half their faces beyond how useful they might become. The effect, however, was undeniable. People softened around him, not entirely, not overtly, but in subtle gestures that caught the edge of my attention, shoulders less tense, gazes meeting his more readily, nods that lingered just long enough to mean something. I did not approach. I remained above, observing from the walkways that overlooked the grounds, watching how Dorian carved space for himself without ever needing to demand it. Ellery stood beside me in quiet vigil, her expression calm, though I knew she saw the same shifts I did. We had grown used to reading power not by words, but by where the eyes drifted, and today, many eyes drifted toward Dorian. When he suggested time in the yard to reorient himself, I answered publicly and without hesitation, offering permission with the same grace they expected of me, even as I felt the weight of what such an offer cost. I couldn't deny him space without appearing fragile, and I would not gift them the illusion that I needed defense from a male I had not yet deemed a threat. Let him test the dirt with his boots. Let him display his form and smile through the exercise. Let them whisper about posture and control, and which hand he favored in a fight. I would not stop them, but I would not flinch either. As the evening settled into the stones, I withdrew to my wing, the hush of the corridors thick with a kind of anticipation that made it feel like every wall was holding its breath. The moment the door shut behind me, I shed the outer layer of politics like armor, peeling off the stiff fabric of my ceremonial coat and letting it fall in a heap across the chair. At the basin, I splashed water across my face, then dried it slowly, eyes meeting my own reflection as I pressed the cloth to my cheek. There was tension in the line of my mouth, but not fatigue, only readiness, the kind that comes before the first blow is ever thrown. I let my fingers trail the edge of the desk as I crossed to the window, the cool air outside biting gently against skin still warm from the tight weight of the day. The heat hadn't flared, but it hadn't vanished either. It moved deeper now, coiled low and patient like an ember refusing to die out, not pushing me to act, but remaining aware, as if waiting to see whether what approached would demand fire or restraint. I sat, opened a scroll more out of habit than intent, and forced my breathing into rhythm, centering each inhale against the sense that the ground beneath my authority had begun to tilt ever so slightly. A knock never came, yet I knew someone had been near the threshold, their steps soft, uncertain, eventually retreating. I smelled nothing immediate, no threat, no wolf too close, but the energy left in the stone was not mine. Later, when I gathered the coat I had discarded, the faintest trace of something unfamiliar lingered near the collar, a clean, masculine scent laced with oil and cedar, one I hadn't worn myself. I froze, not in panic, in memory. That was the same coat I had worn during the greeting, when Dorian had stepped just a little too close while speaking of duty and balance. The scent wasn't overwhelming, but it was there anchored, as if meant to remain. I folded the coat neatly and set it aside, my hands steady despite the cold now spreading from palm to wrist. There was nothing overt in the gesture, no provocation, But intent doesn't always need blade or voice to wound. I remained seated long after the light outside faded, letting the firelight cast long shadows across the floor as I counted how many moves they would make before assuming I wouldn't answer. And I knew, even without turning toward the door again, that every hour Dorian spent on this ground was another weight added to the choice I would be forced to make. Not if but when. And when that time came, he wouldn't see it coming because he didn't believe in fire until it burned. Chapter 24. The stone floor of the inner ring had been worn to a dark sheen by the repetition of generations, wolves rising and falling in the same space, their names forgotten by all but the stones that remembered how they fell. As I stepped into the circle, I felt that memory rise beneath my feet, coiling up through my heels and spine like cold smoke, silent and watchful. The sky above was pale, cloudless, but the air clung low, like the silence before thunder. And though I couldn't smell fear in the crowd gathered along the edges, I could taste their tension, salt-bright, metallic, as sharp as the ring itself. I walked to the center without pausing, my steps measured but heavy with intent, shedding the outer tunic and leaving only the tight black training leather that bore no crest, no ornament, no hint of station. The wolf within me didn't growl or surge. She stood still, ears forward, as if knowing that this wasn't a fight for territory, but for presence. I didn't need her claws. I needed her calm. Across from me, Dorian entered in equal silence, his armor stripped away, his form leaner than I remembered, but still carrying the unshakable air of a man raised on certainty. He moved with trained control, spine tall, shoulders relaxed, his eyes scanning me not like a challenger, but like someone testing the edge of a blade before deciding whether to strike or step away. He didn't smirk, didn't posture. He simply existed with intention. That was more dangerous than bravado. The judge, positioned on the perimeter, raised one arm, her voice flat and ritualistic. Stand. No signal for weapons. No fanfare. No titles. Just the call. I lowered into a wide stance, arms loose at my sides, every tendon primed, not for the attack but for the pause between. The first blow would be unseen, it always was. Dorian approached without a word, his movement slow, calculated, not predatory but aware. We circled each other for a heartbeat, then another, the stillness between us drawing tighter, sharper. When he lunged, it wasn't for flesh. It was for balance, and I gave nothing. Our bodies met not in collision, but in redirection, force into force, breath into breath. I could feel the strain across my shoulders, where the memory of heat still lived, stretched thin beneath the healed muscle like a crack in the foundation waiting for tremor. It didn't break me, but it spoke. He caught it, not immediately, but after the third motion, when I moved just slightly too slow in recovery, compensating with instinct rather than raw force. His gaze flicked, no longer at my face, but at my hips, my ribcage, where weakness often hid. I didn't give him a second look. I gave him movement. I gave him flow. I led him in and out of reach, not letting his rhythm settle. Let him chase it. Let him try to make sense of a body that wouldn't repeat itself. My wolf echoed my control, her stillness a mirror to mine, present but not demanding. The crowd around us never cheered. They weren't meant to, but I heard their breath shift when Dorian overcommitted one step too far, and I spun low, not to injure, but to force retreat. His feet skidded just once, a single break in control, and it was done. The judge lifted her arm. Clear. The word rang harder than steel. Dorian bowed his head with practiced acceptance. I did the same. Neither of us spoke. I turned and walked from the ring, my legs steady despite the ache creeping along my spine, the sweat cooling too fast against my skin. Behind me, I felt the weight of 50 eyes that did not see triumph in what I'd done. They saw restraint. That was what shook them. Not that I had won, but that I had done so without fire, without fury, without even drawing on the full force of what lived beneath my skin. I had given them nothing to measure, and they would fill that silence with fear. The walk from the ring to the keep was silent, but it was not empty. Each step echoed a little louder than it should have, as if the stone had grown more curious, more questioning. The crowd parted as I passed, but no one bowed, and I did not expect them to. This was not a victory worth celebrating, not because I had failed, but because I had left no clear mark to hold onto. The silence I carried with me was heavier than cheers would have been. Inside the hall, Ellery waited, her arms still crossed, expression still unreadable, but her gaze met mine with that unflinching steadiness that always reminded me of how little she needed to say to be understood. She followed me without speaking, our steps in sync until we reached the far corridor near the library arch, where the torches burned lower and fewer guards stood post. Only then did she speak, her voice low and without decoration. You didn't give them what they came for. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She was right. I hadn't. They had wanted something definitive: rage or weakness, collapse or ascension. But instead, I had given them the most dangerous thing of all: uncertainty. I said nothing as we parted ways, stepping into my quarters alone. The door closed with a dull click, and I exhaled, long and slow, letting the silence inside me expand again. My muscles still held the rhythm of the fight, not in pain, but in precision. A single misstep had nearly cost me the rhythm, but not the control. The heat hadn't surged during the trial, but I had felt it, like a second heartbeat pacing behind my own. And now, alone, it began to stretch again, not as threat or ache, but as a quiet, residual warmth along the spine. It wasn't gone. It had simply waited its turn. I moved through the chamber slowly, stripping off the soaked fabric, washing the remnants of salt and ritual from my skin, and stared at the faint bruises already rising along my forearms. Dorian hadn't meant to harm me. That much was clear. His strikes had tested, not punished, but they had still landed. And he had still seen what I hoped others had missed: the moment of compensation, the subtle shift of weight to the right instead of the left, the hesitation that had lasted less than a breath, but enough to mark me. I knew he would remember it, and I knew he would not speak of it, because silence would serve him better than accusation, just as it served the council. I pulled on a simple shift and sat by the window, letting the cold settle against my skin. The stars had begun to bleed through the sky, sharp and white, and the moon hung just thin enough to be considered watching. My wolf hadn't moved in hours, but she was awake. I could feel her, ears forward, body low, not as if preparing to attack, but to listen. She didn't need teeth to defend me tonight. She needed stillness, so I matched her. Somewhere beyond the walls, I knew Dorian was speaking with members of the council. Not in conspiracy, perhaps, but in proximity. That was enough. They would take this result and stretch it until it suited their narrative. She is tired, she is holding on, she will break soon. They wouldn't say it aloud, but they would breathe it into the halls like incense until it settled into truth. I would not fight their whispers. I would let them build a fire of paper, and when the time came, I would give it no spark. Because the real test had never been in the ring. The real test was in what came next, when they tried to use the shape of my restraint as proof of my decline. And I would show them that holding back wasn't weakness. It was strategy, and it was only the beginning.
Chapter 25. Kasia moved across the training ring with a precision that would have fooled anyone who didn't know her as I did, each step executed with care, every pivot tightly controlled. But it was in the small things that the truth revealed itself: tiny compensations, delayed transitions, the subtle way her breath shortened just before impact, not from pain, but from the anticipation of it, as if her body remembered what her mind refused to acknowledge. She struck the wooden post in clean rhythm, reset, and struck again, unrelenting in her focus, her spine taut, jaw locked, refusing to allow even a flicker of weakness to surface. But that in itself was the signal. I watched her from the edge of the ring, arms crossed, saying nothing, because no word would have changed what I was seeing. The heat had receded, or at least no longer tore through her like wildfire, but it had not left her untouched. It had settled, somewhere deeper, like smoke buried in the walls of a burned-out house. There was no fire, not anymore, but the scent of it lingered. When I tossed her the training blade and stepped into the circle, she caught it without hesitation, without comment, her body already shifting into stance before I'd even taken mine. We didn't speak. We never did during drills. But this silence was different. It didn't come from discipline. It came from the space between trust and fear, from the weight of everything we weren't yet saying. Her blade met mine with crisp efficiency, the sound of wood cracking against wood, clean and familiar, but there was no energy behind it. It was technique, not instinct. I changed angles, forced her into new rotations, subtle shifts in weight and timing, and every time she responded, I could see the adjustments she didn't want me to notice. Her right side hesitated, not in error, but in caution, as if she didn't trust her own balance. She moved as someone taught to withstand, not to dominate. When she overstepped on the sixth exchange and recovered too quickly, my hand itched to stop the match, to say something, to ask if she felt it too, but I didn't. I watched, I let her continue, and I let myself record every fragment of movement I knew shouldn't have been there. Her eyes never wavered. Her breath remained steady, but her wolf, which once mirrored every gesture with fierce precision, now seemed quieter, still present but withdrawn, not absent but unwilling to lead. I stepped back eventually, lowering my blade with a neutral nod, and said only what I could say without betraying the storm forming behind my ribs. "You're stronger," I told her, holding her gaze but slower. She didn't flinch. She didn't thank me. She didn't speak. And that silence was the loudest confirmation of all. I watched her retrieve her hand wraps and tighten them without haste, her movements precise even in recovery, but her right wrist trembled once so slightly I might have imagined it, but I hadn't. When she turned to leave the ring, she didn't look back, but the echo of her footfalls against stone stayed with me longer than they should have. I remained there alone, blade still in hand, the scent of dust and old sweat hanging in the morning air, and thought of every time I'd watched her fall and rise again. But this was different. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't stumbled. She hadn't bled or cried or asked for help. And still, something inside her was pulling away quietly, deliberately, as though the damage was no longer something external we could fight, but something internal she had accepted. That was the part I couldn't reach. That was what terrified me. Because if she had decided that silence was safer than asking to be seen, then whatever the heat had started, this thing inside her might not be finished with her yet. And I didn't know how to fight something I couldn't see, only feel, tightening between us like breath held too long. I didn't return to my quarters immediately after Kasia left the ring. I lingered at the edge of the yard, watching the dust settle in the sunlight, the prints of our steps already being swept away by the breeze moving low across the stone. The silence of her absence was almost heavier than her presence had been, and though no one else remained to witness it, I couldn't stop myself from standing in that same place, where her foot had dragged ever so slightly on the third pass, where her right heel had landed a fraction too wide on the final turn. These weren't mistakes any other warrior would have seen. Hell, they weren't mistakes at all, not by standard, not by record. But they were wrong for her, and that was the detail I couldn't shake. When I finally made my way back through the eastern corridor, I didn't go to the council chambers or to the command wing. I went to the long hall outside the infirmary, not to enter, not yet, but to stare at the line of empty beds and wonder if one of them should have been hers weeks ago. She hadn't collapsed. She hadn't shown signs of infection, degradation, or external harm. But something had taken root during the heat, and whatever it was, it hadn't burned out. It had curled into the hollows of her, into muscle memory, into instinct, and made itself a shadow. And now, as I leaned against the cold stone with my arms folded and my wolf pacing behind my eyes, I knew with bone-deep certainty that it wasn't just exhaustion keeping her out of sync. It was residue, the kind that doesn't come from effort, but from interference, the kind that doesn't pass with rest. My father used to say that if a warrior begins to lose rhythm, it means they've either started listening to a new voice or forgotten their own. And Kasia had never lost rhythm in all the years I'd known her. Not even under pressure, not even after loss. Until now, I pushed away from the wall and moved toward the high watch gallery, where old records were kept, mostly ceremonial logs, useless scrolls about council votes and resource metrics. But I needed something to focus my mind, something to keep my hands from shaking with the need to act before I understood what I was fighting. I scanned titles without really reading them, eyes flicking over names and dates, looking for a pattern I couldn't yet define. And still my wolf did not settle. He wasn't restless from fear. He wasn't growling or clawing or bracing to lunge. He was crouched low in the grass of my blood, eyes narrowed, watching not for threat but for betrayal. That difference terrified me more than violence ever could. It meant he didn't believe the danger would come from outside. It meant he thought it was already among us, inside the walls, inside her. I slammed the book shut without meaning to and stood in the quiet long enough to hear the echo of the sound bounce once, twice, before vanishing into the shelves. I hadn't spoken to her, hadn't questioned her, hadn't touched the subject aloud, but if this continued, I would have to. Not because I doubted her strength, but because I doubted what had touched her. And if I let it fester any longer, I would become just another male who watched her fall without trying to understand how to catch her. I left the gallery before the guards could ask questions and took the long route back through the northern hall, passing the old servant quarter wing that had long since been closed off. The doors were locked, the dust undisturbed, but my wolf's ears twitched at the turn. I didn't stop, but I would return, because something had entered this place through silence, and I had let it in. And now I would have to find where it hid before it took more than her balance, before it took her. Chapter 26. The scent hit before I saw it metallic, faintly acrid, threaded with something sharp and sour like citrus left too long in the sun. It clung low in the corners of the corridor, the kind of smell that shouldn't belong in a place like this, at this hour, long after servants had cleared out and the wind had stripped most traces of human movement. I slowed, my boots grinding softly against stone, eyes narrowing as I scanned the base of the wall along the shuttered servant's wing. At first, it looked like nothing, just a folded square of cloth tucked behind a half-rotted crate. But the moment I bent to pick it up, the scent bloomed stronger, unmistakable. Oil, metal, residue from a machine or weapon long out of place. And something else. Something I didn't recognize with memory, but felt in my bones. My fingers tightened around the cloth, not because it surprised me, but because something inside me had already been waiting for it. The wolf stirred slowly, head low and ears forward, not snarling, not pacing, just watching. It wasn't just the smell, it was the shape of what that smell meant. It was a signal, and I'd missed it before. The corridor was silent, undisturbed. But my breath caught as I crouched there, the past rising not with clarity but with weight. A corridor from years ago. My father's footsteps beside mine, steady and measured after a silent patrol that hadn't ended in combat, but in tension. I'd been 17, barely strong enough to hold my form for a full day, and eager to please him. There had been a broken latch on a weapons crate, a misaligned watch rotation. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but I'd asked anyway. Was something wrong? He hadn't answered, just reached down, picked up a strip of stained cloth from the ground gray, streaked with rust, and held it out to me. "Smell this," he'd said, his voice like gravel. I'd obeyed, wrinkled my nose. "Oil, burnt metal." "No," he'd said quietly. Intent. I hadn't understood. I thought he meant sabotage. I asked if we were being hunted. He'd shaken his head once, slowly. "Not hunted. Watched." He'd stood there for a long time, the cloth curling in his hand before speaking again. "Some wolves don't listen to the pack. They listen to themselves. They don't bark. They wait. They smile. They watch you bleed and call it peace." I hadn't known what to do with that at 17. I'd nodded like I understood, then left it behind. But now, standing in the same kind of silence, with the same smell on my fingers, I finally understood what he'd tried to warn me about. I folded the cloth carefully and slid it inside my coat, not because I needed proof, but because I needed to remember that I had held the truth in my hand and refused to dismiss it again. The walk back through the corridor was longer than it should have been, the shadows deeper, the air colder. I should have told Kasia. I should have spoken her name aloud, drawn a thread between this scent and her collapse, between this cloth and the sudden, creeping weakness that hadn't yet left her muscles. But something in me still held back, as if saying it now would shatter what little clarity I still had. My wolf walked in step with me the whole way, his form a silent echo beneath my ribs, and though he didn't growl, he watched every shadow like it might take shape and speak. He wasn't hunting, he was remembering. When I reached the southern stairwell, I paused near the window, letting the cold air hit my face. I thought of how many nights Kasia had moved through these halls under the weight of fire she didn't ask for, of how close I'd been to losing her, not in a storm of blood, but in the silence that came before it. And I realized that whatever had touched her didn't come from sickness or chance. It came from planning, from design, from something or someone who had always intended to reach her through stillness. I didn't say his name. Not yet, but the scent on the cloth, the pause in my memory, the wolf crouched silent in my blood, they all whispered the same word. And next time I heard it aloud, it wouldn't be a suspicion. It would be war. I didn't go to Kasia that night, though every instinct urged me to cross the threshold of her chamber and demand to see her face, to hear her voice and know, even for a moment, that the part of her I feared losing hadn't already begun to fade. But instinct is not the same as clarity, and clarity had become a rare thing since I found that cloth soaked in the scent of oil and something colder than rust. Instead, I turned toward the Eastern Archive, the one few guards monitored, where the older ledgers were kept records so dull and methodical they had outlived their usefulness. And yet tonight, they felt like the only place I could breathe. I lit a low lamp, set it near the edge of the central table, and began scanning supply logs, courier manifests, and weapon cleaning schedules from the previous full moon until now. Most of it meant nothing, numbers blurring against names I didn't recognize. But I was looking for absence, not presence, for something too convenient, too silent. A note scrawled in the margin caught my attention. Wine delivery, privately routed, signed only with a mark, no courier name, no recorded trail, and no verified destination. I stared at that line for a long time, the memory forming in silence. Kasia, seated near the hearth, her hand loosely wrapped around a glass of something deep red, her expression unreadable. She drunk alone that night, and the heat had come after. I shut the ledger without slamming it, pressed both palms against the cold table, and let the weight of realization anchor itself in my gut. If that bottle had been the source, and the cloth I found reeked of the same oil, then someone had introduced the toxin not through brute force, but through trust, through routine, through something that wouldn't be questioned. And there were only a few wolves capable of thinking that far ahead without ever leaving a mark. My wolf stayed silent, but his ears were alert, his presence pressed close to the front of my mind, no longer crouched, no longer circling. He was watching the same line of thought I now traced with reluctant precision. Kine, I didn't say it aloud. Not yet, but the memory rose anyway. Not of violence, not of betrayal, just a conversation, mundane, forgettable, except for the way it now wouldn't leave me alone. Years ago, inside my father's war tent, Kine had hesitated at an order to reinforce the western ridge. He hadn't refused. He'd simply questioned, softened his voice, smiled like he always did, and suggested a delay. My father had dismissed the protest without even lifting his head. "We don't wait for confirmation," he had said. "We move when the air changes." Kine had nodded and left, but the reinforcements had never arrived. When questioned later, he claimed confusion. The command had been misrouted. A simple mistake. We all believed him then. Or rather, we chose not to believe anything else. I walked the long hall back toward the western stair, the cloth still folded in my coat, and felt that same old certainty begin to fray. Kine had always been careful. Too careful. Everything about him had been polite, moderate, measured. Not once had he raised his voice. Not once had he shown more than what people expected. And now, I was beginning to understand that sometimes the most dangerous wolves are the ones who never step out of line, because they're too busy redrawing the lines behind your back. I paused at the base of the high watchtower and looked out across the courtyard, where Kasia's window still glowed faintly against the dark stone. I didn't know if she was asleep, or sitting alone in that same cold stillness I now carried in my blood. I wasn't ready to bring this to her, not until I knew what I was truly holding. But I would not stay still. I would not let silence keep unraveling her without a name to give it. I would find the full shape of this shadow, and when the time came, I would say it aloud, even if it shattered the last of what I thought I understood.
Chapter 27. The ring had been cleared before sunrise, its edges marked not with banners, but with silence, no drums, no cheers, just the heavy stillness of a territory holding its breath. I stood at the center, wind cutting low across the stone, bare-armed and grounded, every breath measured, every tendon strung tight but steady. The pack had gathered early. Even those who never watched challenges came today. Because this wasn't just a trial of strength, it was proof of who still held power, of whether I was still worthy of it. Across from me, Dorian entered with the kind of composed focus that made his presence feel heavier than the space he occupied. He wore no armor, just fitted leather and a faint sheen of sweat already on his brow. He looked rested, controlled, calculated. I didn't let my gaze linger on him. I kept my eyes on the earth beneath us, letting its cold steadiness rise through the soles of my feet. When the elder judge stepped between us and raised her arm, no words were spoken. This wasn't about introductions. We knew who we were, and we knew what this meant. Her arm dropped. Dorian moved first. A clean, fast strike, not reckless, not baited, just enough to test. I blocked with forearm and pivoted left, adjusting for the way his momentum shifted on contact. He followed quickly, pressing forward, trying to corner. But I didn't give him a wall. I gave him space, just enough to make him overreach. The early exchanges were tight, technical, almost beautiful in their rhythm. He was faster, I was sharper, but it wasn't a dance. It was a map, and we were drawing each other's limits. My breathing stayed even. The heat beneath my skin remained low, pulsing faintly at the base of my spine, not igniting, just watching. My wolf moved with me, not ahead, not behind. Present, tethered, I let Dorian push the tempo for the first minute, knowing that an early advantage would only serve him if I met it with equal force. I didn't. I let him show them what he could do. Let them see how cleanly he turned, how hard he drove his shoulder into every strike. Let them wonder. Let them doubt. Then I shifted, not in power but in intent. I stopped reacting. I started absorbing, letting his energy pass through me instead of resisting it. His strikes met muscle but didn't land. His pivots scraped stone but didn't close the gap. And slowly, he began to lean harder, stretch wider, reach further. I let him, until he stumbled. Not from a blow, but from absence because I wasn't where he thought I'd be. I stepped behind his reach, caught his exposed arm with a twist of my hips, and dropped him hard enough to shake the stone. He rolled, recovered, didn't flinch, but the sound had echoed. The pack had heard it. I didn't move to finish him. I backed away. Let him rise. Let them see I didn't need to end it with blood. Dorian stood slower this time, not because he was injured, but because he was thinking. I could feel it in the way he squared his shoulders, reset his stance. He'd underestimated me, not as a fighter, as a strategist. He came again, faster this time, less elegant, and for a moment, just when I felt the heat under my ribs surge forward, lending weight to my next strike, speed to my next step, breath to a body that had begun to tire. Not too much, just enough. I didn't fight it. I let it move through me like a pulse of clarity, grounding instead of consuming. Our final exchange was sharp teeth bared, breath rough but clean. No claws, no collapse, only one figure left standing. When the judge lifted her hand, she didn't need to speak. The pack knew. Dorian lowered his head in acknowledgement. Respectful, controlled, still whole. He didn't look defeated. He looked managed, like someone who had been given the chance to fail with dignity. I stepped back, body humming, limbs alive, but breath still calm. I hadn't bled. I hadn't broken. And in that quiet, I knew what unsettled them most wasn't the win. It was how calmly I'd taken it. The moment the judge lowered her hand, a strange kind of silence settled over the ring, thicker than any cheer, heavier than any gasp. It wasn't awe. It wasn't disappointment. It was indecision. The crowd had witnessed a victory. That much was undeniable, but not the kind they had expected. No blood stained the stones. No one had been thrown to the ground in humiliation. There had been no display of rage, no outburst of animal dominance. Only precision, restraint, endurance. I stepped back and met Dorian's gaze briefly, not to gloat, not to thank, but simply to acknowledge that we had both walked into this ring with a role to play, and I had played mine better. He dipped his chin, respectful to the end, then turned and walked from the circle without once glancing toward the council stands. That told me more than words could. The wolves along the perimeter watched me as I exited, their expressions unreadable, not hostile, but not warm either. They weren't sure what they'd just seen. A leader who fought with control instead of fury. A female who didn't lose, but didn't dominate. I could feel their uncertainty clinging to my skin like dust after a long march. The corridors leading back to the upper wing were mostly empty, which suited me. I needed the quiet. I needed to feel my heartbeat steady again, to catalog the pain in my joints, the subtle pull in my right thigh where Dorian's weight had nearly driven me off balance. None of it was serious. All of it was earned. When I reached my quarters, I didn't undress or collapse. I stood at the wash basin, palms pressed to the cold edge, and stared at my reflection. My skin was flushed, my eyes too bright, but nothing shook, nothing splintered. The heat remained quiet. No flare, no threat, only a thrum like a drum heard through thick forest, distant but steady. My wolf blinked slowly behind my ribs, not stirring, not speaking, but watching. I had passed the test, but I couldn't ignore the truth pressing at the edge of that silence. The test hadn't been for me. It had been for them, for the ones who watched from the raised platform in their polished robes, who measured not just victory, but performance. And I hadn't given them what they wanted. I hadn't snapped. I hadn't roared. I hadn't made anyone bleed. I had held, and that unsettled them more than failure ever could. Later, Ellery came to me with a report brief, too neat. The council had declared the result valid. No objections, no challenges. On the surface, I had secured my place again, but the final line chilled me. The council reserves the right to call for reassessment, pending conditions of leadership. Not failure, not rebellion, just conditions. I read that word twice, then again, and knew what it meant. They hadn't expected me to win, or they had hoped if I did, I'd break in the process. And now, denied both spectacle and collapse, they were crafting a new strategy. One that wouldn't use claws, one that would cut with silence. I folded the report and slid it beneath the stack of correspondence I hadn't touched in days. Dorian hadn't returned to his guest wing. I knew that even before Ellery confirmed it. He'd gone to the council chamber, not to complain, to plant seeds, soft words, measured praise, strategic concern. They would listen, because Dorian wasn't a threat. He was a solution, a fallback, a safer choice. I didn't feel fear as I sat down in the chair by the window. I felt readiness, the kind that coils tight instead of rising up, because I knew now with unshakable certainty that the fight today had never been about who won the ring. It had been about who they could live with, and I wasn't their comfort. I was their warning. And somewhere, beyond the hall, past the firelight and polished stone, I felt a new pressure forming, one that hadn't stepped into the light yet, but would soon, and when it did, it wouldn't be wearing Dorian's face. Chapter 28. The day after the duel broke colder than the season had any right to be. The sky washed pale with that thin, colorless light that made everything beneath it feel exposed, as if the air itself had pulled back in quiet retreat. I woke before the bell rang and dressed without hesitation, binding soft leather over sore joints, sliding metal over wrists that still held the ghost of contact from Dorian's blade. I didn't braid my hair. I didn't wear my crest. I entered the council hall like a soldier, not a symbol, and I did it because I knew the real challenge hadn't ended in the ring. It had only shifted forms. The air in the hall was still, too still, polished and dry like parchment left too long in the sun. No voices raised, no tension in posture, just wolves who spoke softly to one another in corners, who greeted me with faint nods and unreadable expressions. The high table was full, not with betas or warriors, but with elders, men and women whose hands had not seen combat in years, whose power lived in the quiet stacking of words over time. Lucian walked at my side but didn't speak. His presence, though restrained, anchored me more than I could say. When I sat, he stood behind me not as shield, but as sentinel. The meeting began with routine matters: grain storage, healer rotation, travel requests from outer territory. Elder Morik, as always, read each item with slow precision, the weight of his voice never rising, never falling, like parchment reed in a tomb. He had been doing this since before I could shift. He never offered commentary, only announcements, never a personal word, only the will of process. But I saw the signs before he reached the end, the way Varen leaned closer to Orain, the way their eyes flicked toward me, not in challenge but in quiet confirmation. Then Morik paused, folded one page with deliberate care, and shifted to the final point. Item 12: potential review of succession procedures in the event of prolonged instability in leadership. He didn't lift his gaze. He didn't need to. His voice, as always, gave nothing away. The stillness that followed was worse than uproar. I kept my hands flat on the table, my pulse steady. There has been no recorded instability. None yet, Morik replied with the same calm rhythm. But given the physiological irregularities, observed fatigue, strain, and the possibility of hormonal interference, there are concerns. Concerns from whom? I asked, tone sharp but restrained. The council speaks as one, Varen said, his words smooth and oiled. And while your performance in the ring was sufficient, the question lies not in your strength, but in how long it will last. I didn't move, didn't blink. My wolf lifted her head low in my blood, not growling, but narrowing her focus. Then request formal evaluation through the healer's circle. I answered. If health is the concern, we follow protocol. Health is not the only concern, Varen added, folding his hands, fingers too relaxed. Perception matters. If the pack begins to sense that leadership is brittle, they saw what I did. I cut him off, voice quieter than before. They watched me stand when others expected collapse. And yet, he said with a faint smile, they are not cheering. That struck deeper than I expected, not because he was wrong, but because he had identified the exact pressure point they intended to use. Not fact, not failure, but absence. The absence of celebration, of rally, of warmth. I remained silent. Let them believe it was thoughtfulness, not strategy. When the session closed, no vote was taken, no accusations made, only shadows laid out on polished stone like pieces waiting to be shaped into something sharp. They stood in groups as I left, not following but lingering too long, too quiet, planning. When I returned to my quarters, Ellery waited by the hearth. She didn't speak immediately, just handed me a folded parchment, creased from having been read more than once. Inside was a list. Names I didn't recognize, conversations I hadn't approved, movements within the inner ring that hadn't passed through my authority. One location repeated twice. The observatory tower. No reason given. No time logged. My hands didn't shake, but the inside of me did something colder, more precise. My wolf paced once, slow and deliberate, as if tracking a scent she already knew. Ellery didn't speak. She didn't need to. The net had already begun to close. Not fast, not loud, just sure. I didn't sleep that night, not because of fear and not because of pain, but because my blood no longer allowed stillness without suspicion. The parchment Ellery had given me lay on the table beside the dim hearthlight, its contents memorized but not yet processed, the ink already softening at the corners where my thumb had pressed too long. I rose well before dawn and moved through the corridors without an escort, feet silent on stone, cloak wrapped tight enough to pass as another servant. No one stopped me. No one dared. The observatory was a strange place too high for comfort, too far from the heart of the keep to be useful for daily council work. It had always been more symbolic than functional, and yet it appeared twice on the unapproved movement list. No reason, no timestamp, no signature, just movement. I climbed the final spiral of the narrow staircase, slowly, letting each step echo in case someone waited above. When I reached the door, it wasn't locked, but it hadn't been closed properly either. I pushed gently. It opened with a soft breath. The room smelled faintly of ash and something sharper metal, perhaps, or old smoke. The telescope stood still in its frame, turned toward the mountains, untouched, but the cushions near the wall had been moved slightly out of line. A thin scratch in the floor where one had been dragged. A teacup on the windowsill, dry but recent. My wolf bristled, not in fear, in recognition. This wasn't a council space. It was a listening space. Someone had used it for silence, for watching, for planning. The room wasn't warm, and the hearth hadn't been lit in days, but I felt the echo of presence, not magical, not otherworldly, just recent. Like someone had been here not long ago, and had left only when they knew no one would follow. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. I stood in the center of the room and listened, not with ears, with instinct, and what I heard was absence arranged too carefully to be random. There had been words here, not shouted, spoken softly, strategically. It felt like politics disguised as privacy. I turned and left the room exactly as I had found it. When I returned to my quarters, the keep was just beginning to stir. I didn't speak to Ellery. I didn't write anything down. Instead, I sat by the cold window and let my eyes blur against the first threads of light unraveling the edge of the horizon. They were preparing something. Not a coup, not a war. Something slower, something quieter. And that, more than fire or steel, was the danger I'd been trained for but never truly faced. My wolf hadn't sat since I left the observatory. She still paced low and slow in the back of my mind, paws deliberate, ears back. She wasn't tracking prey. She was circling the scent of betrayal. I hadn't heard Kine's name. No one had spoken it, but I could feel the outline of his absence, the way it pressed into this place like a handprint over cold stone. I knew it wouldn't be long now. He wouldn't return as an enemy. He would return as an answer, as a proposal, as something palatable to those who feared me more for my control than they ever had for my fire. And when he did, they would not frame it as a challenge. They would call it balance. Chapter 29. They said he was gone, that no one had seen him since the border unrest last year, and even those who remembered his name did so with a peculiar strain of caution, like invoking something that wasn't truly absent, only waiting to return. But the moment the messenger stepped through the heavy oak doors of the council chamber, carrying a letter sealed in gold and bound in black ribbon, I knew. I didn't need to hear his name. I didn't need to open the parchment or ask a single question. The shift came from inside the way my wolf went still, not in fear, not in threat, but in pure, watchful calculation. I sat straighter, anchoring my spine to the cold wood of my chair, but made no outward sign. Around me, the other counselors fell quiet as the messenger approached the high table and bowed low before Morik. Even Varen, always so eager to fill silence with slow poison, said nothing. Morik took the letter with fingers that didn't tremble, broke the wax seal without ceremony, and unrolled the parchment with deliberate, grave movements. He read it aloud with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned how to gut a voice of all emotion. The undersigned, Kine Vestal, descendant of the Western lineage, hereby declares intent to re-establish formal presence within the council's jurisdiction, not in challenge, but in accord. In recognition of current instability, he offers his guidance, should it be deemed useful. The words landed like snow on marble, quiet, cold, slow to melt. But they weren't weightless. I felt them settle across the chamber like ash. Kine wasn't returning to take anything. Not on the surface. He was returning to offer, to support, to help. And somehow, that sounded far more dangerous. My heartbeat didn't rise. My hands didn't move. But the muscles between my shoulder blades coiled tighter with every breath. Lucian, seated one chair to my left, didn't react either, but the way his jaw clenched was enough. The letter was placed on the center table by Morik, fingers flattening it like an oath. "The request will be honored," he said, voice dry as parchment. No vote, no discussion, just obedience, just protocol, which meant the real decision had been made elsewhere quietly, long before I ever entered the room. Afterward, I didn't linger. I left the chamber with deliberate pace, eyes forward, aware of every glance that followed me from behind, none of them sharp enough to name as threats, but all too smooth to be benign. By dusk, word spread. No formal announcement had been made, but the keep pulsed with it. The guards moved differently. The servants whispered like something had shifted in the walls. I stayed on the upper balcony, watching the ridge where arrivals usually came at first light. But this one broke tradition. A single car, long and sleek, black as dried blood, rolled through the southern gate just as the sun began to vanish. It stopped at the foot of the courtyard without flourish. No fanfare, no armed escort. The driver stepped out, opened the back door, and there he was. Kine Vestal, the man who had once sworn loyalty to my house, who had disappeared without warning, who had never been formally exiled and yet had returned as if invited. He stepped out slowly, wearing a simple dark coat, the collar upturned, hair cropped clean. No weapon visible, no arrogance, only composure. A man reborn for presentation. I watched from above as he moved toward the keep doors, not looking up, not hesitating. But just before crossing the threshold, he paused 1 second, maybe 2, and tilted his head slightly. His eyes, sharp and colorless in the fading light, rose to meet mine. Not a challenge, a greeting, and something more, something I couldn't name. My wolf watched. She didn't growl. She didn't snarl. She simply adjusted her footing inside me, as if preparing for a long pursuit. I turned before he could look again. If the council had once watched me with wariness, now they sat in a kind of stillness that reeked of decision already made. Their gazes no longer challenged. They simply redirected, shifted toward him. Kine did not stride in like a conqueror. He entered like a resolution, quiet, composed, palatable. Each word he offered was soft, yet exact, crafted with the restraint of someone who knew precisely how far to go without appearing to reach. He never said my name. He never referenced my strength, my leadership, or the challenge that brought me here. Instead, he spoke in abstractions, about continuity, about the burden of singular command, about the strength of shared legacy. His voice didn't push. It pressed, not as pressure, but as presence. Calm, stable, male. Familiar. He offered nothing overt, but each phrase he delivered fit precisely into the cracks the council had spent weeks carving into the walls around me. And what they couldn't say directly, he said without ever making it personal. Even the strongest leaders benefit from balance, he said, when asked what role he saw himself serving, especially in times where the appearance of control must match its function. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was satisfied. No one corrected him. No one reminded the room that my function had held through combat and scrutiny alike. Because they didn't want to. They wanted this, a smoother shape to carry the same structure. Not a better wolf, a more obedient one. I remained composed. I spoke only when required. But beneath my skin, my wolf stood fully alert, her muscles braced, her ears drawn back. She didn't rage. She listened. She counted the spaces between words. She measured how many seconds passed between Kine's soft answers and the council's nods. She didn't see a usurper. She saw a design. Lucian stood behind me the entire session, unmoving, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. His silence wasn't tactical. It was reverent, an instinctual restraint born of recognition too old to explain. I could feel his heartbeat, measured and tight, and when the meeting ended, he remained in place, long after the others had gone. Varen lingered to speak to Kine by the arch near the stair, heads tilted, voices low, their conversation masked as formality. Morik left without a glance, but his pace was slower than usual, and for the first time, I realized that stillness could be an answer. I waited until only Lucian and I remained in the chamber. You recognized him, I said, not coldly, but with precision. Not just now. Earlier, Lucian exhaled, barely a breath. Not until he opened his mouth, he replied, his voice flat. But my wolf did. The moment he entered the room, he turned to me, face unreadable. The smell was there, beneath everything, faint but exact. The same oil, covered over, but never gone. My mouth went dry, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that I hadn't misread the silence in my own body. I had only refused to speak its name. They won't move against me directly, I said, watching the flame in the nearest sconce flicker. No, Lucian answered. They'll let him offer help until you look unreasonable for refusing it. And I knew he was right. The new strategy wasn't to fight me. It was to gently separate me from the pack until I stood alone, until refusal looked like weakness and acceptance looked like wisdom. Kine wouldn't argue for power. He would simply become the answer to their doubt. Slowly, kindly, publicly, my wolf didn't pace anymore. She circled, her breath even, her focus absolute. She wasn't waiting to strike. She was choosing where to aim. I turned toward the tall windows and stared out into the darkness where his shadow now lived, not as a threat, but as an invitation. I would not answer it gently. Chapter 30. The day I stood before the council again, I wore no crest, no sigil, no outer indication of title, only black, clean, and simple, the kind that does not demand to be seen but refuses to be ignored. I stood without guards, without fanfare, without even Ellery at my side. Because this time, it was not strength I needed to display, but stability, control, structure. The air in the chamber had changed since Kine's arrival. Not heavier, just thinner, like oxygen had to pass through approval before entering your lungs. As I walked to the center of the stone floor, I felt eyes track my every step. Some measured, some indifferent, some calculating what their posture toward me would cost now. I let them look. I let them guess. When I turned to face the high table, Morik was already watching me, his hands folded, his shoulders still as stone. I waited for him to finish reading the prior session's record, then stepped forward, voice steady but clear enough to cut across the silence. In accordance with the founding charter of this territory, I said, I am invoking the clause that permits the expansion of the council body up to 3 provisional seats when demographic shifts or emerging domains justify greater representation. A pause followed, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. The clause was real, ancient, rarely used, and yet indisputable. Morik blinked once, slowly. His lips parted, but offered no protest. The pause passed to Varen, who leaned slightly forward, his fingers interlaced like a scholar at a debate table, though the tone of his voice carried the weight of a verdict. Expansion of this sort, he said with poised disapproval, is typically reserved for times of territorial upheaval or annexation. Neither have occurred. No, I said, meeting his gaze directly, but we have seen transition, realignment, and that is movement. The council has not reflected the current population or balance of roles for over a decade. This is overdue. Someone exhaled through their teeth, whether in scorn or surprise. I didn't care. This is not consolidation, I added. This is representation, something many of you have praised since Kine's return. That name, the syllables of it landed like a note too perfectly timed. I saw the ripple it caused, subtle shifts in breath, slight pivots in the seats behind the elders. And then he spoke, from the side bench, where he had chosen to sit just outside authority, but well within reach of it. I support the proposal, Kine said, voice measured, smooth. Adaptation does not dishonor tradition. It fulfills it. Our laws were written to endure change, not resist it. He smiled faintly, not at me, but at the room, and the room answered, not with applause, not with allegiance, but with stillness that leaned slightly, fractionally, in his direction. Varen did not argue. His eyes sharpened, but he said nothing more. I let the pause stretch just long enough to feel like command. Nominations will begin at first light, I continued. Territorial branches will send observers, and from that list, 3 candidates will be selected through full council vote. All procedures will follow protocol. Morik shifted for the first time, his hand resting against the edge of the table. You understand this introduces volatility. No, I said softly but firmly. Volatility comes when change is blocked. This brings accountability. My wolf inside me stilled, her breath deepening, her body no longer crouched, but stretched tall. Not victorious, not content, but awake, listening. I hadn't broken their rules. I had used them better. Now they would scramble not to block me, but to adapt. Because structure, when shifted properly, becomes its own weapon. And I had just moved the first stone. After the session ended, the shift didn't collapse, it deepened. Conversations continued in hallways, not in confrontation, but in undertone. Wolves who hadn't spoken to me in weeks offered quiet acknowledgments. Not support, not defiance, just acknowledgement. That was the first symptom. Not loyalty, but attention. In places like this, power doesn't declare itself through noise, it circulates in glances, in pauses, in who follows whom down a corridor without speaking. By midday, 2 minor territory envoys had sent requests for appointments to discuss eligibility for nomination. That had never happened before. Not in my reign, not even during Lucian's. The council hadn't expected movement this fast, and I knew why. Because they hadn't planned for anyone to act. I returned to my chamber late, shoulders heavy but not in defeat, just weighted with what I now carried, momentum. Ellery was waiting with an updated report, already categorized by region. She didn't comment on the names or the sudden rise in correspondence. She only handed me the sealed file and left. That was her way. Clean, precise, trusting me to read what needed reading. I sat beside the window, the sky outside flat and gray, and opened the file. I read names I hadn't seen in years. Young leaders I barely remembered from their parents' introductions, now stepping into something larger than themselves. Some were safe, some were ambitious, one or two were likely dangerous. I didn't flinch. I welcomed it, because now I could see the shape of what they thought they could control. And I would rather meet 10 bold voices than one masked silence. I sensed movement outside the chamber before I heard it. Kine. I didn't rise. I didn't call for him. I let the moment hang, let him decide what it would become. When the knock came, I answered with a neutral tone. Enter. He did, without hesitation. His expression was calm, unbothered by the storm that had begun to ripple from the council's center. I thought I might offer congratulations, he said, voice smooth, measured. The vote wasn't a vote, but still you made history today. I closed the file and set it aside. Is that what it was? Progress usually is, he answered, even when it's dressed as compliance. I tilted my head slightly, studying him, not his posture, but his stillness. The way he occupied space without claiming it. That was his skill. He didn't dominate. He adapted. You support this, I said, not as a question. I support function, he replied. Stagnation benefits no one. A broader table creates room for nuance. Nuance, I repeated. Or control. He smiled faintly, neither confirming nor denying. You're not afraid, he said at last. Most would be. Fear doesn't serve me, I replied. Clarity does. He inclined his head, as if impressed, but I saw the flicker of something deeper in his eyes, a note of calculation, adjustment. He had expected pushback, not invitation, and now he had to recalibrate. Then I hope your new voices bring strength, he said, and not more noise. He turned without waiting for dismissal. I didn't watch him go. I watched the air settle after him, like a room adjusting to the absence of something heavy. My wolf paced slowly beneath my skin, not in warning but in rhythm. We had struck first, but the answer had come not in retaliation, not in denial but in grace. That was his method. Not fight, framing. Let others write the narrative. Let others drift in his direction out of exhaustion, not belief. I stood and crossed to the inner shelves where the older charters were kept. One line echoed from the original laws. To represent is not to speak louder, but to be harder to silence. And for the first time since Kine returned, I realized I didn't need to shout. I only needed to make room for others who would not let their voices be pushed aside. That was how this would turn, not through dominance, but through endurance. And I was already built for that.
Chapter 31. After the chamber cleared and the voices faded down polished stone halls, I remained where I stood, surrounded by stillness that didn't feel earned. The chairs were empty, the banners unmoved, but something in the air remained unsettled, like a question suspended mid-breath. I should have followed Kasia. I should have offered words, a presence, something that grounded her before the next tide began to rise. But I couldn't. Not yet. My wolf wouldn't let me. Not out of pride, out of unease, the kind that doesn't scream or claw, but coils slow around the spine. I turned away from the council wing and took the narrow stair behind the main corridor, the one used by archivists and scribes, carved deeper into the mountain, where light was thin and silence heavier. No guards patrolled here, no scrolls for policy or strategy, only record stone and scent. This was where we marked oaths, where truth was etched, not spoken, and memory lived longer than the blood that once declared it. The room at the base was colder than I remembered. Bare walls, 5 stone columns, and on the inner ring names carved into ritual bands, each one representing a vow made before the pack and its alpha. I moved along them slowly, not searching but waiting for instinct to guide me. My fingers paused when they brushed the one I hadn't visited in years. Vestal. Kine. The oath had been taken 7 winters ago in a room above this one, lit with torchlight and ceremony, when we still believed loyalty was a matter of structure, not character. I remembered the smell of resin, the way the oil clung to the blade my father carried, how the weight of tradition sat too neatly on Kine's shoulders. He didn't seem proud. He seemed prepared, as if the moment had long been rehearsed, down to the cadence of each word. I'd spoken the vow myself, not as alpha then, but as heir designated speaker of the line. Do you swear to serve not just the alpha, but the pack, with your body, your voice, and your will? Kine had nodded once and said, I do. Do you swear to speak not what is easy, but what is true? Another nod. I do. Do you swear to place the safety of the people above ambition, legacy, and blood? And there it was, the moment I hadn't remembered until now. He hesitated, barely, a single beat too long, so small it passed unnoticed by the others. Then he said, I swear. Not I do. not the binding reply the ritual required. But no one spoke. Not my father, who had conducted 20 such oaths. Not my mother, who stood watch by the oil basin. Not even me. I had smiled, had clapped Kine on the back, had welcomed him with pride, because we all wanted the vow to hold. We needed it too. And in that need, we overlooked the absence that now rang louder than any spoken word. My hand stayed on the carving longer than I meant to. The grooves were shallow but unbroken. The wolf inside me shifted forward not with rage or fear, but with the solemn gravity of recognition. He remembered that hesitation. He had marked it when I had chosen to ignore it. And now, standing in the dim light of a room meant to preserve legacy, I realized how legacy can rot in silence. The moment Kine twisted the vow, he rewrote the shape of what followed. Not visibly, not all at once, but enough to give him space, enough to let something grow that had no place here. I stepped back and let my palm fall from the stone. The scent had faded over time, but not enough. Not for me, and not for my wolf, who watched from within like a sentinel beneath ice. I left the chamber without touching another name, already knowing none of them would burn like that one. The echo of absence followed me all the way up the stair. By the time I reached the upper halls again, the last of the daylight had drained from the sky, leaving the corridors steeped in that blue-gray shadow that makes walls look farther apart than they are. My steps didn't echo. I moved as I had when I was younger, when silence was not a choice but a survival skill. The memory of Kine's hesitation clung to me like residue. I couldn't wash off an oily trace of something that had always been there, but which I had refused to name. And now, having faced it fully, I knew one thing without question. What he left out that day had shaped everything that followed. I had spent years calling it caution, diplomacy, even wisdom, but it had been omission, a calculated one. And we had let him slip past it, not because we didn't notice, because we did and didn't want to see what it meant. That kind of silence becomes a habit. It becomes structure, and once it's in the foundation, it spreads. I passed 2 sentries at the south wing archway. Neither greeted me. They looked away the way soldiers do when unsure where loyalty should land. That told me enough. The rot had reached them too, not in disobedience, but in hesitation. I returned to my private chamber, but didn't light a fire. The cold helped. It reminded me I was still rooted in my body, that I hadn't drifted completely into memory. My wolf wasn't pacing anymore. He sat still and sharp, every muscle alert. And I understood now, he hadn't gone silent in retreat. He'd been waiting, watching, letting me catch up. I crossed to the cabinet beside my desk and unlocked the inner drawer. Inside was a stack of council correspondence, most of it recent, some sealed, some crumpled where my fingers had clenched too tightly while reading. I moved them aside until I found the one I'd kept from the week Kine reappeared. A simple envelope, no wax, no crest, but the handwriting had struck me from the first moment, not because it was his, but because it was too careful. The language inside had been polite, respectful, filled with vague references to support, transition, balance. But there was one phrase I hadn't forgotten. Should current leadership become unsustainable, it is my duty to ensure continuity through counsel or, if needed, proximity. At the time, I had read it as a beta's readiness. Now I saw the design in that wording. Not loyalty, positioning. He had known what would unfold before even setting foot on our land. And the council had known too, or at least part of it. I dropped the letter back in the drawer and locked it. Then I sat and stared into the empty hearth for a long time. I didn't call for Kasia. She had moved her first piece. She had expanded the board, and she needed space to hold it. But I would not wait anymore. I would not give Kine the space I once allowed. That silence, my silence, was the crack he had used. I stood, crossed to the window, and looked out across the mountains where the last line of dusk still clung to the horizon. The world had gone still for now, but not for long, because I finally knew what my wolf had been trying to tell me. The danger wasn't in the force Kine would use. It was in the permission we kept giving him, and I would not give it again. Chapter 32. Some wolves earned their place through war and fire, others through quiet endurance, and Thompson was the kind of man who never asked for recognition, but never failed to arrive when silence became too loud to ignore. He appeared before I called, the weight in his stride signaling more than urgency. It was understanding, the kind formed not in courts or politics, but in winters survived together, in unspoken truths carried across years. He entered my chamber just as the sky paled with the first light, carrying not only the council's morning summary, but a folded page of names he had drawn himself. Names he suspected I would be considering now that the tide had clearly turned. He did not ask what I planned, nor did I offer anything more than a nod, but that was the measure of our bond. We had walked through too much shadow to mistake quiet for hesitation. When I laid the first message on the desk, he took it without reading the name, tucking it carefully into the inner lining of his coat, the gesture practiced, respectful, and never performative. 7 riders, I said evenly, watching his posture. 3 trusted, 4 newly vetted. They'll leave before midday. No crests, no color. You'll write them all by hand. He asked, not as doubt but confirmation. I nodded once. No one else will speak in my place. That earned the faintest flicker of approval from him before he turned and left the room to prepare what needed to be done. Alone again, I sat by the hearth and unrolled the parchment slowly, ink already smudging across my fingertips from the pressure I hadn't noticed building in my grip. I wasn't writing threats. I was sending signals to those who hadn't yet decided where they stood, to those who had been waiting for someone to move first, and to 1 or 2 whose loyalties were never bought but might still be borrowed, if only for the right cause. These were not declarations of war, but neither were they benign. Every word was chosen for weight, for tone, for memory. My wolf had grown quiet as I wrote, not withdrawn, not distant, but attentive, crouched low inside me like a shadow that knew the pattern of every step I was taking. I sent the first 3 letters with Thompson himself, and watched from the outer window as he passed the gate without ceremony, vanishing into the fog-draped horizon like he'd been made for such things. And perhaps he had. By midday, I walked the length of the keep, eyes open to shifts I hadn't noticed earlier in the week. Younger wolves straightening as I passed, others who avoided eye contact no longer glancing away with disdain, only uncertainty. That was fine. Uncertainty could be turned. It was silence that killed. I saw Cale speaking with a junior officer in the lower hall. He caught my gaze and nodded first, a small thing, but enough to shift the balance. When I returned to my quarters that evening, I found Thompson's second list on the table, marked by hand with 3 new possibilities, their names annotated not by rank but by pattern, where they had stood during the vote, what they had said before and after the session, who they had followed into the corridor. It was meticulous, almost surgical. I hadn't trained him for this, but he had learned by watching, and now he moved like someone who saw not just surface but structure. I studied the list in silence, then picked up the final blank sheet and stared at the space where a name should go, knowing this last message would not be carried by courier, and might not even be delivered at all. Some wolves need to be asked in person. Some truths must be handed across fire, not paper. And this name was not for diplomacy. It was for reckoning. The name I had avoided writing for too long was no longer content to remain unspoken. It sat just beneath the surface of every decision I'd made since the moment Kine stepped back into the chamber, and by the time the shadows in my study reached the tips of my boots, I knew I could not wait another hour. I sat again at the desk, the wood cool beneath my palms, and took up the final blank page with a kind of reverence I rarely allowed myself to feel. The man whose name I now committed to ink had once stood beside me not as subordinate or rival, but as something closer to reflection, darker, perhaps, but clearer, shaped by pain neither of us had spoken of aloud. He had vanished from the political structure years ago, not in disgrace, but in protest, and unlike others who had simply withdrawn, he had made no effort to return. He refused rank. He refused command. He refused to let himself be used. And now, as I folded the page and tied it with unmarked cord, I wondered not whether he would answer, but whether I still deserved to be heard. My wolf stirred slowly as I sealed the message, his breath curling like fog along my spine, not aggressive but attentive. We both understood what this meant. This letter was not an alliance. It was a line in the earth. When I stepped away from the desk, I moved to the eastern wall where my father's map still hung, its edges worn, its ink faded, but its structure intact. I let my fingers trace the borderlands places we once called strongholds, now quiet or broken, some swallowed by council appeasement, others hollowed out by the slow erosion of purpose. I paused at one name, whispered it without sound, and remembered the last time I heard his voice. Low, measured, full of disappointment not in me, but in what I allowed to happen. I had told myself then that I would prove him wrong. Now I only hoped I hadn't already proved him right. Outside the study, the keep was still and thick with the scent of changing weather. Thompson's last report had noted wind shift in the western corridor, suggesting travel delays, and I'd made no note of it then. But now I understood. Every step must be timed. Every risk must be calibrated. The silence that surrounded us wasn't peace. It was breath held before decision. I crossed back to the hearth and stared into the cold ash, the memory of fire still lingering faint in the stone. My wolf hadn't growled in days, but he hadn't stepped back either. He waited, not for orders but for readiness. We no longer needed to argue. We were aligned. I took up the set of letters Thompson had delivered, flipped through them slowly, and let the details settle deeper into my mind. Small expressions of caution, veiled agreements, refusals too polite to be called resistance. They were watching me now, not out of hope, not out of allegiance, but out of calculation. That was fine. Calculation I could work with. I didn't need blind faith. I needed openings, and cracks, and pressure points. As I laid the last letter down and turned once more to the window, I saw the ridge line cloaked in the earliest draw of night, the sky above it neither warm nor cold, just stretched thin like skin over something waiting to break. I could no longer afford hesitation. The council would not wait, and if Kine continued pressing forward under the guise of consensus, Kash's voice would be drowned before she ever truly stood alone. I would not allow that, not because of the bond, not because of love, but because she was the first one among us to stop asking permission. And if she stood at the edge of the fire, I would not leave her there without someone ready to meet the flames from the other side. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. Like, subscribe, and let me know. What would you change, and do you want the next part of this story? See you soon, my moonlit listeners.